Florida farmers once grew nearly half the nation's winter tomatoes. In less than a generation, they watched a tidal wave of cheap Mexican imports surge from 800 million to 4 billion pounds, crushing local livelihoods and leaving even the state's governor blindsided by the scale of the devastation. How did trade deals meant to help fuel this collapse, and who let these warnings go unanswered until families were already on the brink? The human cost behind these numbers is only just beginning to surface. In 1994, the United States imported 800 million pounds of fresh tomatoes from Mexico. By 2022, that number had soared to 4 billion pounds, a five-fold increase in less than 30 years. Shipments once measured by the truckload now arrive by train, then by container ship, flooding United States markets during Florida's peak growing season. The scale of this change is measured not just in pounds, but in livelihoods. Where Florida growers once supplied nearly half the country's winter tomatoes, their share shrank as Mexican imports carved out a dominant position. By 2022, Mexico was supplying about 90% of all tomatoes imported into the United States, with a market value topping $3 billion a year. The result? Florida's tomato industry was cut in half, hundreds of family farms disappeared from the map. The numbers on paper, 800 million to 4 billion, translate to a wholesale market where domestic growers were forced to compete against prices set thousands of miles away, often below United States production costs. Dumping margins calculated by the Commerce Department in 2019 averaged 20.91%, confirming what growers had warned for years. The volume was not just a matter of competition, it was a tidal wave that reshaped the entire industry. Each new shipment arriving from Sinaloa or Baja California meant one less truck leaving Immokalee or Palmetto. In the space of a generation, Florida's tomato fields went from bustling with harvest crews to standing silent as buyers turned to cheaper imports. These are the numbers that frame the crisis, cold, precise, and impossible to ignore. Behind every statistic is a family whose future hangs in the balance. On a patch of land just outside Palmetto, the story of Florida's tomato crisis is written not in numbers, but in the hands and faces of those who have tended these fields for generations. The Alvarez family's roots run deep in Manatee County soil. Grandfather Luis remembers when every neighbor on their road grew tomatoes, when the start of harvest meant long days, tired backs, and the certainty that hard work would pay the bills and keep the farm in the family. His daughter, Maria, still keeps the ledger her mother started in the 1970s, pages filled with handwritten notes on weather, yields, and the names of pickers who returned each year. For decades, these records told a story of steady, if sometimes modest, prosperity. Now, the entries have changed. Instead of tracking shipments heading north, Maria's notes chart the weeks when buyers stopped calling, when prices fell so low it cost more to pick than to leave fruit on the vine. Her son, Daniel, who once dreamed of running the farm, works nights at a nearby packing plant to help cover the mortgage. The family has let go of half their acreage. Rows that once burst with green are now overgrown, a reminder of the years when the farm supported not just one family, but several others who depended on seasonal work. Neighbors gather less often at the local diner where conversations used to revolve around weather and crop rotation. Now talk drifts to rumors about which farm will close next, or which longtime worker has left for construction jobs in Tampa. The sense of community, built over generations of shared labor and mutual support, has begun to fray. For the Alvarezes, the fear is not just about losing a business, but about losing a way of life that once seemed as steady as the seasons. The impact of trade policy decisions made hundreds of miles away lands here in quiet moments when a family wonders if they will be the last to carry on a tradition that shaped their identity and their town. In 1996, a new rulebook was written for the tomato trade between the United States and Mexico. This was the year the Tomato Suspension Agreement took effect, pausing an official United States anti-dumping investigation after Florida growers accused Mexican exporters of selling tomatoes below fair market value. Instead of imposing duties, both countries agreed to a system of minimum reference prices. Mexican tomatoes entering the United States could not be sold for less than a set amount.
an attempt to keep prices from falling so low that American growers would be forced out of business. The agreement was not a treaty, but a deal struck under the authority of the United States Department of Commerce. Its reference prices became the baseline for all Mexican tomato shipments, regardless of market swings or seasonal gluts. If a shipment arrived priced below the reference, importers faced penalties and the agreement could be suspended. The goal was to create a level playing field, at least on paper, and avoid a trade war that would disrupt the supply of fresh tomatoes to American consumers. Over the years, the suspension agreement was renegotiated several times, most recently in 2019, but the basic framework stayed the same. Florida growers argued that the reference prices were too low and too easy to evade, while importers and retailers said the agreement protected American jobs and kept grocery shelves stocked year-round. The system's complexity meant that every tomato crossing the border was tracked, priced, and checked against the rules set in 1996. For growers in Florida, the agreement became both a shield and a barrier, a legal structure that promised protection but often delivered frustration instead. Dumping in economic terms means selling a product abroad for less than it costs to produce at home. For Florida tomato growers, this wasn't just a technicality, it was the root of a fight over survival. Under the suspension agreement, Mexican exporters were required to sell tomatoes in the U.S. at or above a set reference price. On paper, this was supposed to stop unfair undercutting. But growers in Florida watched as the system was picked apart by loopholes and workarounds. Some shipments were repackaged after crossing the border, obscuring their true origin or price. Others were labeled in ways that allowed them to slip past enforcement, especially during periods of oversupply when prices crashed. The reference price meant as a floor often became a ceiling, an open invitation to sell as cheaply as possible without technically breaking the rules. And when market prices dipped below even that floor, enforcement lagged or penalties seemed toothless. Florida growers argued that the agreement structure made it easy for importers to game the system, flooding the market with tomatoes priced just low enough to squeeze out domestic competition. The frustration was not just about economics, but about fairness. Policies intended to protect American farmers instead set the terms for their decline. For those working the fields in Florida, it felt less like a safeguard and more like a trap, one that left them watching from the sidelines as their own market slipped away one shipment at a time. On June 16, 2023, the Florida Tomato Exchange filed a petition with the United States Department of Commerce, formally requesting an end to the 2019 tomato suspension agreement. The document ran dozens of pages, outlining what growers saw as years of broken promises and failed enforcement. The petition did not come from a single farm or even a single state. It carried the signatures and support of tomato producers from across the country. Their argument was clear: the agreement had not stopped the flow of below-cost tomatoes from Mexico, and the damage to American growers was only getting worse. They cited dumping margins, confirmed by federal investigators, averaging more than 20%, and pointed to hundreds of documented violations since the last renegotiation. The request was not for negotiation, but for termination. Once filed, the petition entered the machinery of federal review. The Department of Commerce received the document, logged it, and opened a file, but then the process seemed to freeze. Months passed with no public response, no docket updates, and no word from Washington. Growers watched the calendar, hoping for hearings or a timeline, but the official silence stretched on. For many in Florida, the lack of movement felt like a familiar pattern. Past petitions had triggered swift negotiations, or at least a round of public statements. This time, there was nothing. No press releases, no agency visits, no sign that anyone in authority was listening. Industry groups on both sides of the border issued their own statements. The Fresh Produce Association of the Americas, representing importers, criticized the petition as disruptive. Mexican officials called for more talks and warned of trade retaliation if the agreement was scrapped. But from the federal agencies tasked with enforcing trade laws, there was only quiet. The silence became its own kind of message, a reminder that for all the urgency in the fields, the wheels of government could turn slowly or not at all. The petition sat in Washington, waiting to be acted upon, while the growers who sent it waited for any sign that the system would finally respond. At the Alvarez home, the kitchen table becomes a war room. Maria sits with her ledger open, phone pressed to her ear, listening to hold music that never seems to end.
Every morning brings a new round of unanswered calls to the co-op, to the broker, to the bank. Daniel paces the hallway, his work boots trailing dust across the tile. He's just come off a night shift, his eyes heavy, but sleep can wait. The family's questions hang in the air. Will the bank call about the loan? Will the next check bounce? What if the buyers never return? The silence from Washington feeds a different kind of anxiety. Maria's father, Luis, stands at the window, watching as clouds gather over fields that once promised a future. He remembers years when a bad season meant tightening belts, not fearing the loss of everything. Now neighbors trade rumors in hushed voices. Someone heard a farm up the road is done for good. Another saw the auction signs go up overnight. The sense of being left behind, of waiting for help that may never come, settles over the house like humidity before a storm. In town, the local school's parking lot fills for a hastily called meeting. Parents and growers pack the folding chairs, voices rising as they share stories of missed payments and empty shelves. One woman stands to speak. Her family's farm is 3 generations old, but this year she says they will plant less than half their usual crop. She asks if anyone has heard from Tallahassee or from Washington or from anyone who can say when or if the rules will change. The only answer is a long silence. Heads bow, hands clench, and someone mutters that it's always the same. Decisions are made far away, and consequences are paid right here. Back at the Alvarez farm, the day ends without answers. Maria closes the ledger and Daniel heads out for another shift. The family braces for another night of waiting, their future measured not in acres or pounds, but in the lengthening shadow of uncertainty. On April 14th, 2025, the U.S. Department of Commerce issued a press release that landed with the force of a thunderclap across the tomato industry. The statement was brief but unmistakable. The 2019 Tomato Suspension Agreement was terminated, effective July 14th. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, most Mexican tomato imports would face a 20.91% anti-dumping tariff at the border. The announcement cited years of documented price dumping, with Mexican tomatoes sold in the U.S. at margins averaging over 20% below fair value, according to federal investigators. The Commerce Department's action was not a negotiation, but a final decision. The reference price system, which had governed trade since 1996, was swept aside in favor of direct duties. The press release spelled out the new reality in clear terms. All fresh tomato imports from Mexico, with few exceptions, would be subject to the full tariff rate. The policy shift was immediate and sweeping, touching every importer, distributor, and retailer in the country. For Florida growers, the language read like long-awaited vindication, a recognition that the market had been distorted by years of underpriced competition. The document included the exact figure, 20.91%, calculated from the Commerce Department's latest dumping margin analysis. Within hours, industry groups issued statements. The Florida Tomato Exchange called it a long overdue correction, while importers warned of price spikes and supply disruptions. In Washington, lawmakers from Florida praised the move as a victory for domestic agriculture. The legal framework that had shaped the tomato trade for a generation was gone, replaced by a single, hard number. The decision drew a line under decades of frustration and set the stage for a new era, one defined by tariffs, not negotiated floors. Growers across Florida woke to headlines they had waited years to read. For many, the news brought a rare surge of relief, a sense that the tides had finally turned after decades of watching their market erode. Phones rang non-stop in the offices of the Florida Tomato Exchange. Robert Genther, the group's executive vice president, released a statement within hours. He said terminating the agreement was the only way to finally give domestic growers the relief they have long deserved. His words echoed through farmhouses and packing sheds from Homestead to Quincy. Some growers admitted to tears, others to cautious optimism. After so many seasons spent fighting to survive, the prospect of a fairer market felt almost unreal. State officials scrambled to understand the full implications. The governor's staff, caught between celebration and concern, fielded urgent calls from lawmakers, industry groups, and reporters seeking comment.
In Tallahassee, aides worked late, drafting statements and briefing memos. While the governor had championed Florida agriculture in public, the decision from Washington arrived without warning, leaving state leaders racing to reassure farmers and consumers. Behind the scenes, staffers weighed the risks of higher prices against the promise of renewed local production. In the fields, the mood was electric. For the first time in years, growers spoke openly about hiring back workers, planting more acres, and investing in equipment. One farmer, voice shaking with emotion, called the announcement the break they needed to keep this farm in the family. The sense of vindication was real, but so was the knowledge that the fight was not over. The next season would be a test, not just of policy, but of whether decades of loss could be reversed by a single decision. Today, a single trade decision can erase generations of work in a season. As tariffs reshape the tomato market, the livelihoods of thousands still hang in the balance. Food security and fair competition are no longer distant policy debates. They are choices with local consequences. The future of American farms depends on who's willing to fight for them now. What do you think? Does the system protect its own?